independent photosynthesis, where things happen for us. You know, there's more detail out there. There's various membrane stacks, the thylakoids in the chloroplast and stuff. We're just talking here about that it's in the chloroplast. Reactants means what goes in, products means what comes out, and I'm trying to make a connection here, right? So some of what comes out of this one goes into the next one, and those are both pushed by some energy source. Here, it's sunlight, right, to begin. We're talking about that high intensity value of a photon of light. Light's crazy because we experience it both as a ray and as a photon, this like energy packet at the same time. So it's in like two phases at once. And in plants, right, those chlorophylls, pigments inside the chloroplast, are absorbing that energy. That's then allowing the light reaction to happen. And it's the result of that, that little bit of ATP, and you might have read also an ADPH, right? That then moves into like independent reaction to make that happen. But the question came on, what does it mean to be a limiting factor? So the limiting factors are light. Yeah. So in general, a limiting factor is you run out of something. You don't have something that would then stop the reaction. Yeah. So in this case, absolutely. If there's no light, then light reaction's not going to be initiated. And then there's one other one, at least here, Andrew. Water. Water. Exactly. So to get that light, right, chlorophyll absorbs, gets energized, and that very next thing is then to take those water molecules, break them apart to get that oxygen. And if we don't have water, obviously, then that's not happening.
So the reactants just be pigments, like chlorophyll?
Yeah.
More than that?
Yes.
And the external limiting factors, this is all of the other things needed.
So again, when I filled this in, I put those specific spots for the top. I remember just chloroplast. And then so here, the limiting factors are carbon dioxide. If you don't have any, right, then the whole thing about putting carbons together to make glucose, right, that C6 compound, isn't going to happen. And if you don't get the energy, right, this stuff, that's a result of the light reaction, then the light independent step also will be stalled. So the point of those limiting factors is to think about how we reduce the instance where they're actually limiting. Right? So of course, if you could provide light all the time, you're eliminating that as a limitation. If you're sufficiently irrigating, you're eliminating water, right, as a limitation. And here, if you're in an environment with sufficient CO2, we talked about that importance of having to open stomata to get this thing in that's in such small supply in air, right, that oftentimes makes this the most limiting piece of the equation. And then likewise, if you don't get the energy again from the first step, there's no rolling the ball down the hill, flipping the switch, you know, do it the next step. Clear?
Would carbon dioxide not be a limiting factor for light reactions as well as a reactant?
For the light reaction?
Light reactions, yeah. Because if the stomata are closed,
What's that?
like if the stomata are closed, then photosynthesis can't occur because there's not a high enough concentration of CO2. So
That's right, but only once you get here. The first step can still happen.
Oh.
The light can still be absorbed, even with stomata closed, and the water can still be in that high energy chlorophyll, still broken apart to get to producing this and releasing oxygen. But then, yeah, if you stomata are closed and all the internal CO2 is used up, that's then when you get. So that's the exact point, I think, of dividing these out, is to see that, right? So during the day, you're getting light all day, right? And then at night when it's plenty growing outside, right, not supplemental, then this part is slowing down, and so everything that's happening here is dependent on absorb ahead of time, right? So that's an obvious limitation is daylight.
So would like carotenoids and chlorophyll like not count as a reactant? Is that just like one good filter, or like how would that fit? Or does it?
Yeah, so they're not like
Yeah.
going into they're not being changed
Yeah.
by the reaction.
Just more just filtering light.
Well, they're present,
Yeah.
and they're absorbing the energy, but, yeah, they're not being changed by the reaction. So I guess that's the thing where water is being split apart, carbon dioxide is being split apart and changed. And so that's what we say, like, they're not really in the reaction, they're helping produce it in the same way that Rubisco or RUBP, that enzyme that grabs onto carbon, it's still at the end, it grabs onto carbons, it puts them together, and then it's still that same enzyme at the end, and it does this whole thing again.
Okay.
So it's unchanged, just like that.
Sounds good.
Christopher first and then Marina.
Is glucose only produced in the light-independent reaction, or was it both?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, so that's the end game here, comes out. You need the energy from the first step to get to pushing that Calvin cycle wheel, turning the wheel so that the Rubisco grabs onto the carbons and sticks them together. So again, without that energy, then that part won't happen, preventing the glucose from getting created.
Is light-independent reactions only happening when light isn't present? It's happening, it can happen
All the time.
Okay, so
All the time.
light reactions is only when there's some type of light form or UV.
That's right. That's why that is light independent,
Gotcha.
right, and not dark reaction.
So but it can be.
Always happening, light or no light. But
Okay.
this one, exclusively in the presence of light. It's that energy, whether it's sun or, supplemental light, that is getting absorbed by the chlorophyll and making that first step happen. Yeah, so if we don't have that, then the whole, right, nothing else happens. Like if you don't have your car key, you can't turn it in the ignition or click the fob or whatever these days, right? So the car doesn't start at all. Whereas like you have the car key, you can turn the ignition and it clicks, but if the alternator is busted, then you can't go to the next step of actually sparking and igniting. So it's like domino steps in the process.
That's like you said for plants though, right? Don't they perform the Calvin cycle at night? Isn't that right?
Well,
That would be a dark reaction?
that's
Or is it only solo?
hold on. So in the cam plants, right? So they're still absorbing during the day, right? And they're storing that for use that night.
Got it, okay. It's
So they-
separated into
yeah,
two
so they
steps.
still can absorb light when it's not there, right? But when it is there, they're grabbing it all, saving it for nighttime when it's less risky to get CO2 into second step, right? Whereas in C3 plants, it's all at the same time. They're both absorbing it and using it right away.
Okay.
Does the reverse also happen in can plants where instead of storing up the ATP during the day and using it at night, they're storing up the CO2 and using it during the day? Does it go both ways?
Not really. So any plant in the kind of, say, pre-dawn hours, right, temperature is still lower, it's less risky to have your stomata open. But then as soon as they start closing, say any cam plant, any whatever cactus, then because that CO2 is such a low percentage of air, it's getting used up relatively quickly. And so the same as any plant that would have early morning stomata are open and they close, there's a period where there's some available CO2, but there's not really enough to save it for later. Yeah, so that's a big
So
problem.
that's socking away all night and just as good.
Yeah, so once upon a time in like, the days of the dinosaurs, a couple 100 million years ago, Carboniferous period, right, per the name, all these volcanic eruptions were putting tons of carbon into the air, it was getting trapped by the atmosphere, and there was higher percentage of carbon, so plants could grow faster and bigger. You saw all those giant like fern type cycad plants, right, that just look enormous, but still could only do that part when there's light. And then there was a hand in the back, yeah.
Yeah, so the original product of the light independent reaction would just be carbon, right? And then that's combined with, the other byproducts of the light reaction. And you said it's Rubisco doing that still, or is it something else?
So start again, the product of the light independent reaction?
Yeah, which originally would just be carbon, right? When it's breaking down the carbon dioxide.
Well, so carbon goes into that reaction as carbon dioxide, and then it's pulled apart the carbon from the oxygen,
From the
right?
hydrates.
And just the carbons that are put together by that Rubisco, that's right. That enzyme, that its role is to, once the energy source kicks it into gear, it's able to turn it on, right? Like the ATP says, yep, do your thing now. Then the Rubisco is pushed to grab that first carbon and break it apart, and then that cycle happens. And then if there's another unit of energy, it does it again until it puts all these carbons together enough to make a glucose. So this whole thing, I've got the answers for all of this, but after people turn in and submit online and stuff, I'll put that up on Google a little bit later. Other questions from the homework? You can see in 21, right, I'm asking you about, here I've got more detail than you need. But once upon a time, I was doing this for someone else teaching the class and just trying to leave them as much as possible. So what goes in and what goes out is basically the question, right? Same thing, then you chart it here. Ask about photo respiration. Spent a bunch of time on Monday talking about this unfortunate situation, right, for C3 plants anyway, where under the situation where they're running out of carbon dioxide, now that Rubisco is grabbing oxygen instead, and the result means using energy instead of making it, right, and not getting sugars to make more energy later. So it's like a 1-2 negative punch of both losing energy and not getting any later means you're way behind. And I said that can be when that wheel gets turning, there's no carbon dioxide and a lot of oxygen, then 20 or 25% overall reduction, right? That's going to force that plant then to open stomata, whatever conditions, in order to keep making food, right? And that's where things get challenging for a C3 plant in that situation, because you need carbon dioxide to keep growing, right? To keep making food to live. At the same time, losing a lot of water in doing that.
We keep saying carbon dioxide, and then it fixes it into the malate, but with the oxygen being the waste product, it's not critical or vital to the function. So is it actually storing CO2, or is it just storing carbon in the malate, or are we glossing over things that we don't discuss?
In the chem plants, you mean?
Yeah.
So, here's,
Because it would be difficult for it to like store gas.
that's right. So here, yeah, it's that PEP or PEP enzyme is grabbing those carbon dioxides, taking them apart, putting just the carbons together to make like a thing that's storable rather than an expanded gas.
Make sure I was thinking about that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
The second part of that really makes it seem like the sugar creation is happening during the day in camp plants.
It does.
It does.
It does, just without like, that was something I
But
have on.
that was my question earlier, but whether they sock up the CO2 at night and they use it during the day.
You're right. I think I then answered backwards for the previous question. Yeah, so let's go to the presentation. So yes, they are absolutely storing those carbon. So so the distinction there is to Christopher's question. They're not storing the carbon dioxide. They're storing the carbons as that, like malate, as this like intermediate thing, right? So it's, yeah, because you can't store the gas in space. You need something more compact to do that. And so then they take energy, and this is why growth is slow. Then they take energy from the thing they just did, right, last night, move it back to carbon dioxide, so that then they can go through the next step of the process. So they get it at night, they use it during the day, but by flipping back and forth twice, right, they've spent a bunch of energy doing that, which slows things down, but means still survival under harsh conditions, right? Big temperature swing, low humidity, often very high temperature during the day, high demand on water use.
But they still produce glucose during the daytime. This is not, they don't use the light process to produce the glucose. So it's not like it's only produced at night.
Anytime there's sufficient CO2,
Yeah.
Right.
So it's produced just without the use of light, not necessarily just at night. So it's like got me confused with camp, and they're functioning only at night with the stomatas, and then I kind of lumped that glucose production together with that, but that's not the case. So the light independent process happens in the daylight as well.
that's right. For all types of photosynthesis, that light independent reaction through the Kelvin cycle that results in these carbon compounds that become glucose is happening all the time. And as long as, right, no limiting factor has been hit, which slows the process or stops it. And in the case of the cantless, again. So yeah, step one is stomata open only at night. That's get in as much carbon dioxide as you can, and then save it for day, so that then you can use it while that energy is being absorbed in the light reaction, because you still need light for that first part, right? So any plant now, C4, C3, or CAM plant, out here in the, still got to play by the rules of the light reaction. So the light comes in, need that first, absorbed, split that water, and then that whole other part, second step of light independent reaction is possible in those CAM plants then, because they have that saved CO2. Yeah.
Oh, what is an LA molecule?
Yeah. So, again, we're kind of hitting the edge of this chemistry class, and so I think the big distinction there, and I have here in so malate is
Can I piggyback on the malate question, or, so I know, like, malate is like the salt form of malic acid, and I know malic acid is, named that way because apples, malus, have a lot of, malic acid. Is it just a coincidence that, apples are making all this malic acid, and that's also in ham, or is there any sort of cross between the two since the malic?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, apples are not
Yeah, that's-
CAM plants.
Yeah.
So, I would guess there's something else to the history of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's also, there was this early plant research station in the UK called the Malling Station that was also an apple research station, so some things that have mal are from malling and some are from malice, which also came from that. So yeah, I'm not sure how it's all connected there. But the gist of it here is that malate stores as a 4-carbon molecule, which is very convenient to chemistry-wise. This is a oversimplification, but carbon bonds 4, and so that means it's real easy then, right, to have all these spots that put more carbons. And the thing that C3 plants make, C3P, puts 3 carbons together, which is a little less stable of a molecule, so not so good for storage, which is why like it's a temporary intermediate until 2 of those are put together, and then 6 pairs up better.
So it's just an amount of atoms bonded that so it makes it like a malate.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, it's just the name. And so here, you can see, right, the difference is from 3 to 4, that's a third increase in how much carbon you can store per molecule.
I just didn't know if there's like a deeper meaning what it makes, that makes it a malate molecule beyond that, so.
Yeah, for this, I think just stick with 3 carbons versus 4, right? 4 gets you more at a time, 33% more every time.
Okay, good.
Other questions? Cool. So I assume there will be more, and please bring them up. And then as we get into respiration, I think that we will bring some up and clarify some things. Keep in mind, just the core of each thing, what goes into that step, the light reaction, what comes out, what goes into the light independent reaction, and what goes out. Overall, that is the whole deal of the whole equation, photosynthesis. So definitely know, right, the light and water and carbon dioxide are involved, and of course then, if you're without one of those, then that becomes your limiting factor. And the result is sugar and oxygen. So that much should make sense. Again, understanding chlorophyll's role in absorbing that light energy and the relationship to why we see plants as primarily green, where it's not absorbed more in the red, orange, and the blue-violet spectrum. And also make sure you understand the consequences of photorespiration. You don't need to know about all these things around here, but that it's that carbon-grabbing enzyme, rubisco, that not enough carbon's there, it gets oxygen, and that result is a negative in terms of not getting the sugar and taking energy in, right, to do so. So with that, let's take 5 minutes, and then I will start on respiration. carbohydrate glucose plus oxygen, right, which coincidentally, not coincidentally, are the two things that came out of photosynthesis, right? It was for the products of photosynthesis. Go into respiration. It needs water, it needs carbon dioxide, and it yields water, carbon dioxide, and energy. So, when I ask you on the quiz, the products of respiration, the number one point value will be to tell me that it's energy. You tell me that it's water and carbon dioxide, that's good. But energy is the goal, right? Just like glucose is the most important product of photosynthesis. There's oxygen too, but this is the important thing. So, carbohydrate in, glucose in the presence of oxygen. And so again, in that pulling things apart to get the energy out, we're literally burning them. We talk about metabolism, right, as burning calories. And so that oxygen is fueling the fire of metabolism, right? Fueling the fire of tearing apart those sugar molecules to get more energy. So in terms of limiting factors, when we run out of oxygen, the fire is slowing way down. And of course, if we run out of the glucose, there's nothing to break apart, right? And the process is going nowhere. And I ask you here, does this look familiar? Well, it should. If you think about it the other way, flip everything around, in photosynthesis, you have light energy in, right? Some other energy source in, and carbon dioxide, and water, and what comes out, right, is oxygen and glucose. So what that energy is changes, but one way, photosynthesis, the other respiration, and that little bunny is just taking advantage, right? Using all that yummy grass and using it to respire. All organisms respire to get energy, right? Just like they all have mitochondria for this purpose, plants are unique in having chloroplasts to create the glucose that goes into the process. To my point, ATP is the universal energy currency in living organisms. And we're talking about energy. And this means adenosine triphosphate. It tells us something about the structure of that molecule. Don't worry about that. When you think ATP, energy. You think energy in a plant or animal for that matter. You think ATP is the thing. So respiration has two primary types. This is getting at Christopher's question from Monday. What I presented on the last 2 slides ago as the equation is aerobic respiration in the presence of oxygen. This is the most common and gets you the most energy. Right? So plants and animals want to be aerobically respiring whenever possible. Otherwise, the energy harvest, the yield at the end is much lower. And that's called anaerobic respiration. Without oxygen, 16 times less. A subset of anaerobic respiration is fermentation. Again, no oxygen. It produces alcohol, lactic acid, etc. That's how we get stinky cheeses and beer and wine, right? And lots of nice things. Because there are certain organisms, right? Yeasts, for example, are fungus that only respire anaerobically or have the capacity to do so where other organisms can. Plants are focused on aerobic respiration, and that's why that oxygen presence matters. Fortunately, in comparison to the CO2 needed for photosynthesis, right, I told you about 21% of the air is oxygen, so much more readily available, right? Thousands of times more available than the carbon dioxide, so even having stomata open for a short time is sufficient to get the oxygen in to do this process. Respiration has 3 steps in the way that, excuse me, photosynthesis has 2. enzyme regulated, just like the Rubisco enzyme in photosynthesis was the carbon grabber. These enzymes are biological catalysts, again, that make a reaction happen more quickly at lower energy threshold and are not consumed in the reaction. So it starts in cell cytoplasm and is completed in the mitochondria. So again, here we're talking about within a cell, because all cells are making energy, in the mitochondria, the site of respiration. The oxygen's not necessary to begin, but it is needed to complete the aerobic step. So just like in the light reaction where CO2 wasn't needed to begin, right, we just needed light and water, but couldn't finish the process of making glucose without it, it's the same situation here. But with oxygen, to maximize that energy output. So, for these three steps, again, try to keep it simple. You don't need to know every compound involved, but you do need to get the concept of how things move from one to the other. So you do, in photosynthesis, light reaction, released oxygen, and produced this little bit of energy that kick-started Kelvin cycle, the light-independent reaction, right, that then put carbons together to make sugar. So if what I just said there, in summarizing photosynthesis makes sense, keep it at that level for respiration. So the first part is glycolysis. So glyco refers to the glucose or glycogen that's being broken down, and lysis is tearing apart. It needs a little bit of energy to start. And the result of it is a little bit more energy. Right? You need 2 ATP units to start, you get 4 out, and it releases CO2. So, let's map this out. And simplify one. So, one is glycolysis. So what goes in is your glucose and a little bit of energy. What comes out, more energy, and CO2. So again, there's a corollary with photosynthesis where the first step, energy in, oxygen is released. Here, right, energy in, and carbon dioxide is released.
Those pyruvate also a product, or are those completely?
So pyruvate is the equivalent of the G3P in photosynthesis. It's this intermediate carbon molecule. And so, so far in this step, we've gone from glucose, which is a C6 molecule, to, so that's glucose, to this pyruvate, right? And again, just keep it simple here. We don't need to know about the pyruvate necessarily, but it's a 3-carbon thing. And so by splitting this in 2, right, that's where this energy comes from. This, what I said, was for ATP here. And then likewise, this whole thing is, and that's where the carbon dioxide released to. Andrew?
I'm sorry, I'm kind of catching a bit. So you're saying like the first is, that's gonna be our location, and that's gonna be our reactant, the ATP plus CO2 is what it's like producing. Right, okay.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Is reactants in, products out, and then, so then at the end of this step, what you have is these 3-carbon compounds that gotta get broken down further to get all the energy out. But so far, we've started the process. somehow start the process. In photosynthesis, it was the energy from light, right, that started the light reaction. And then to start the light independent reaction of the Calvin cycle, it was the ATP made in the light reaction. Here, it's ATP that came from previous respiration.
So that ignites it, and then the 4 ATP that comes out of breaking the pieces apart is like a heat.
That's your yield. Yeah, that's what you're getting in terms of energy. Yeah, and we'll see later that a lot of it is lost as heat.
It pays back the initial ATP, does that go back into storage for the next process, or is it?
Sometimes. It all depends on how high heat is at the moment. Like probably that just goes immediately into starting the next carbon getting broken down, right? That 4 minus 2 is 2 could be immediately consumed there. But under circumstances where there's a lot of light, it's also possible that it can get stored. Or, right, if it's really rapid growth, it might be sent elsewhere to like, oh, putting on a lot of leaves over here now because the sun's really high on this side. So it depends. But the most proximal location is for this to go right back up to the top and have it start grabbing the next carbon, the next glucose, and ripping it apart. And that-
I just want to make sure I understood the Berube thing correctly. So the Berube is just a 3 carbon molecule, as a malate is a 4 carbon molecule.
That's it.
Just an okay, cool. Just want to make sure.
And yeah, and so in both these processes, those are just intermediary, temporary positions for holding those molecules together.
Got it.
Where'd you get to the property sentence, where'd you get to the
I got to this by taking the glucose, which is C6, and then the first step in the process is for the energy from the ATP and the enzyme together to pull it halfway, right? Pull it apart, and what you end up with is a thing that has 3 carbons in it. Some of the oxygen's lost with the carbon dioxide. So for every one of these, right, to get technical, for every glucose with 6 C's, when you start pulling it apart, if you put 3 of the C's into this next step, you got 3 left over, right? And so those 3 then go into 3 carbon dioxides, which that's 3 times 2 oxygens, which is 6 oxygens. So those go over here. And then you got a bunch of hydrogen left over that goes into something, another part of the process, which you'll see later. Any idea what that might be?
that's the ATP? Is that transferration?
Well, ATP is its own thing, right? So, right, some of these carbons, some of these oxygens become carbon dioxide. Some of these hydrogens will become water.
So this second, the 3 CO2s over here, that's the actual ATP.
No, that's carbon dioxide. So ATP is its own energy unit, right? So that's not really quantified here because it's the energy. Yeah, so I'm trying to get to the core without it being just chemistry. So that the energy that we call ATP, this little packet of energy, is in the bonds holding these things together, these carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And so that enzyme breaks that bond, that energy is released, but that doesn't make this, it's still a carbon or a hydrogen or an oxygen. It's that the energy that was in between keeping them together is now available.
So that's how you get your ATP return, is the energy release. What you're saying.
Little louder.
That's what you're saying, is that how you get your ATP return is the energy release.
Exactly. That's right. So, step 2 here is the citric acid or Krebs cycle. First note is to keep these cycles. Krebs cycle is the second step in respiration. Calvin cycle, second step in photosynthesis. So find a way to keep those clear, or call the second step in photosynthesis the light independent reaction and avoid that possible confusion. So Krebs cycle. Now remember, we're left here with some 3 carbon things from the last one and some energy. We're in the mitochondria now. And this one depends on this acetyl coenzyme A. This is our new enzyme for this part of the reaction. Just get the point that each one requires some catalyst to make it happen. That's what we call this one. So we're further breaking down carbons through these steps. Here, pyruvate's being broken down more, that C3 thing, right? The energy is getting transferred into ATP, and more CO2 is released. So again, here we get what goes in, right, is this thing. So a 3 carbon molecule. And what comes out, so that's in, and what comes out is U2 and 2 of those. You get it? So this is like, again, sort of like the 3 carbon thing. This is just like the intermediary step, the middle step, where it's just more breaking down, but not all the way yet. That's the technical, don't even go there. Take that out. And step 3 is called the electron transport. This is our big payoff. It's the final step. And this is where oxygen is required. So, like we saw, to this point, here we got a net 2 ATPs, and here it was 4 were produced, but it was a net 2, if you will, because 2 ATP had to go in here also. This 2 here. So there was a net 2 here, and a net 2 here, and if you stop there, right, that's anaerobic respiration. Those steps, no oxygen, this thing didn't happen, you get those, the 4 ATPs. Right? If you have oxygen, then this chain reaction of moving these electrons around continues to finish breaking down that glucose until the end result is a bunch of ATP, which happens when you go through it one time. What comes in is these carbon molecules. What comes out is ATP. So I'm not going to ask you like exactly how many, but the point is a lot here, right? A big number, a small number, and a small number. So having that oxygen in the final step gives you that big payoff. And Christopher was hinting at heat loss earlier. And so for all this work, we get these 36 units of energy, molecules of ATP. Only about 40% is actually stored energy available for the plant that can either be used to grow right away or to save somewhere to be ripped apart later or move somewhere to be used. And 60% is lost as heat in the reaction. And so that's not that efficient, but still, for biological processes, it's pretty efficient to get 40% is usable energy out of that. If we got 40% of everything we ate was usable, you're doing okay. And so, how do you think that 60% that's heat is released, right? Because it's got to go somewhere, lest the plant just continuously be heating up and heating up from this process. There must be a way right? To get it out of there and cool the plant down so that it doesn't risk denaturing its own cell membrane, say, by being too hot inside the mitochondria.
For the stomach.
Via stomata? Sure, but first it's gotta get there, right?
Yeah.
So it can get out of the plant from stomata, but then, yeah, it has to be moved outside the cell, also. And,
So would it make water to transport the heat through the vascular system?
yeah, exactly, water holds a lot of heat,
Yeah.
and that's a great way to get it out. So, we need water for photosynthesis, and we need water to basically absorb that heat energy and then lose it through stomata. So, another important function of that transpirational pull is removing the heat produced in respiration, right? So if we have, back to those quiz and test questions of if the stomata were always closed, right, then all the heat generated in respiration, some will be lost cell to cell to the outside, and you can see condensation maybe on the stem, but majority would be trapped inside, heating up the internal structure and putting the plant at risk of damage from denaturing those proteins.
I'm just thinking of plants going through like a cold snap or something. Like, does that mean that trees are gonna respire more to keep their core temperature from freezing, or like I'm just thinking about the metabolism in the winter of plants. And,
Yeah. It's a delicate balance. So that is absolutely one way to generate more heat, right? Would be to use up some energy, right? We do that too. Like we're feeling cold, and just like jiggle around, do a little run or whatever quick, and then get some going to release some heat. But in the case of the tree during the winter time, now you have to distinguish between the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The angiosperms have a big limitation of it's all stored energy now that they're going to be using up, right? So don't want to use it all. Better to just steel yourself against the elements and hope you make it through than burn all of your reserves, unless it's extremely cold, right? And probably in 2 weeks, we'll get to what this response looks like inside of plants generally, but I think it also varies. And in the case of the gymnosperms, because there's still leaves, right, and there's still this slow, constant, like the hair growth rather than the tortoise race, excuse me, the tortoise growth rather than the hair race, I'm all backwards today. There is that possibility then to do a bunch of metabolism to try to raise that temperature. And so plants are, because the response is dispersed, right, meristematic tissue all over the place to make things that are needed, and the willingness to seal off an area that's either using too much resource or is damaged, they'll concentrate on the most important tissues for survival and just make that, right, area warmer. So if it's, say the crown of a herbaceous perennial over the cold winter, it's not going to worry about, we'll keep those leaves that are, they're going to fall off anyway, or they're going to die back. Make sure that the crown and that apical bud don't die by increasing that temperature. Yeah, that dispersed response is just incredibly adaptively useful, because you can say, this part survives and the rest of this I'm not going to worry about. Whereas we can get frostbite and lose a foot or a hand, right? But we can't decide like, no, stop there, and the rest is going to be fine. It's just based on exposure. So we get all this energy, right? Finally, the big payoff. We end up losing a lot of it as heat. But biological organisms, right? We're not perpetual motion machines. Everything is going to have some kind of heat loss in getting the energy. So plants are doing quite good. Again, when we get technical, this is available. Just remember, it's in the mitochondria. Always, just as a bit of an aside, whether it was the chloroplast in photosynthesis or the mitochondria here, moving things across a membrane one way or the other is a great way to stick energy on or peel energy off, stick a molecule on or peel a molecule off. And so we often see these things happen here, right, with the help of our carrier proteins embedded in the membrane. And you can see, like in the case of the mitochondria, little brain here, all this is additional membrane, right? It's not just like the kidney on the outside, but it's all folded so that there's lots of surface area for doing all this constantly in high volume. So this is the core level summary: glycolysis, breaking down, getting a little energy, Krebs cycle, breaking down more, releasing carbon dioxide, final step, electron transport, getting all this energy, and water is then released. Likewise, from the input of oxygen in the third step, and that hydrogen that we were talking about back in glycolysis paired up with the oxygen to make the water.
As mitochondria, do they release that water into the cytoplasm and it picks up from there?
Yep, could be stored in the vacuole in that same cell, could be transported into the vascular system, depends on the specific need, the temperature, humidity conditions. But it's formed again, crossing that membrane. So when it's made, then it's outside of the mitochondria in the cytoplasm of the cell. So it's one less step to move, one easier to get it going where you want. Aerobic respiration, just showing the comparison. Okay. Same thing up here, stripping these glucose down, but no available oxygen, and you can get two different results. Some bacteria, mammal muscle, that's like when we have a cramp, right? It's lactic acid as a result of not enough oxygen. Or yeasts, I mentioned earlier, they're fungi, and they create ethanol and release carbon dioxide, and that's how we get fermented things. So, to compare, aerobic, of course, involves oxygen. That's aero. It means that it gets more energy, less energy, no oxygen. But they both require glucose, right, and produce a little bit of energy. So that's the level there. A lot of energy from aerobic, less from anaerobic, significantly less. But they're both respiration, methods of harvesting energy from stored food that require the presence of that food, the glucose, and give you energy to do work. That work is the growth of the plant.
I'm sorry, I'm probably asking something you just answered, but as far as the two circle graphs, the efficient 38, that's what it produces, not what it uses, right?
Produce, that's right.
Produces, okay.
And so, again, that's like 36 from here and 2 from here, that 2. There's, depending on which source you look at for that one, it kind of depends on where in the process you define the parameters. Some will say, oh, it's 38, it could be 40, so that first 2 from the beginning. Don't worry about that. Just think about a lot of energy here, a lot of energy in aerobic generally, much less in anaerobic, which is, again, that's our anything that you're fermenting, your stinky cheese, beer, wine, your muscle cramps. So now let's talk about how this connects with the conditions. We've been getting at it a little bit with Roland's question about the heat, and Chris's question about moving things around as needed. But I want to make sure that you understand the connection with temperature conditions, humidity conditions, when it comes to both of these processes, and let that understanding inform your management. we talked with photosynthesis about having enough carbon dioxide and about where, when the temperature is so high now, to a point that we can add more CO2 for more efficiency, and then we hit some max temperature where more CO2 isn't gonna help. This is as fast as the plant can produce food, and so adding more in beyond that is no longer a benefit. And there's a similar situation in the case of the energy harvesting of respiration. Generally, as temperature rises, respiration rate rises. So that's graph here, temperature, Fahrenheit, respiration rate. See, it rises quite a bit more, up to 122, than photosynthesis does. Photosynthesis, you hit that threshold more in the low hundreds, 104-ish. For those C4 plants, and even lower for some of the C3 plants. But as temperature rises, respiration rate rises. So the plant can grow faster when temperature is high because it's more quickly breaking apart glucose to get the energy to grow, right? To put on that flower, to make a new shoot, to make more roots, to absorb more water, to put that water into photosynthesis, right? So hopefully now it's starting to fit together, cycle of things. Generally, 18-degree increase, Fahrenheit that is, 10 Celsius, doubles the respiration rate. So, on the one hand, increasing temperature makes for faster growth, right? On the other hand, if you're doubling that rate, right, when you go from 70 degrees to 80 degrees, so it looks about right. It looks like it's at about 1 on that side to maybe about 2 in that range. That also means doubling that rate of respiration means you're using up a lot more glucose, right? You're releasing a lot more water from that reaction and to dissipate the heat, so the demands are high, right? So as temperature goes up, those plants are going to need a constant supply of glucose to do this, sufficient water in order to make it happen, or they're not going to be able to take advantage. And if they can't, right, then they can't make that energy, and growth is going to suffer. We talked about the heat loss already. Just a reminder. Okay. And so these connect to the homework question on the back page 4, and also put together what's happening in photosynthesis and what's happening in respiration. So I hope that through what I'm saying now and your own review, these make good sense. So let's take this for a second. Again, temperature along the bottom on the x-axis, you can see as temperature rises, the rate of life rises is how I titled that one, but okay, so this is, the orange line is the food produced in photosynthesis, right? Here's called photosynthase, but think about it as the glucose, and then the blue line is that same glucose, how much is used in respiration. And so any time that we're making more glucose than we're using, everything in that green zone is possible plant growth. That's the zone where then the plant can expand in size, it can reproduce because it has sufficient energy to do its base level biological processes and then some, and then add on leaves or roots or flowers, etc. So you can see at low temperature, it's pretty close. At very high temperature, as you get up here, because of that rise in, that fast rise from the last one, it starts shooting up over here in respiration. Once we pass, 100 degrees or so, plant can't make more food than what it's doing, but it can certainly use up a lot fast. So at those high temperatures, the plant's at a deficit. So it's breaking things apart and respiring, giving off lots of heat, right? Because it's hot outside too, but not growing, right? Not putting on more mass. So there's an ideal zone, right, where this is the widest up here. And again, this is generalized for plants. Right? Various species are going to have a graph that looks slightly different, but you can see it's kind of in like the mid-upper 70s zone in a general sense, where things have the most capacity for photosynthesis and a rate of respiration that allows for the growth in between. Does that one make sense so far? I think this one, so it's two ways to look at the same thing. So again, the relative relationship with temperature here. You've got respiration is the green one now, photosynthesis is the red one, and net photosynthesis is the red one. So in the way that this one is showing you the difference here, this one is actually this thing, gross photosynthesis, how much total is made, minus the respiration at that spot, right? So if you, in a gross sense, if you took this and put it on this, right, then you reach that same point in the graph. So that is to say, at high temperature, again, very little net photosynthesis, right, while still having very high respiration. So this is a dangerous position for plants at high temperature. At low temperature, you know, there's still, the net photosynthesis is a little bit more, right? Because respiration rate at low temperature is very low. That fuel generated from breaking things apart can only get started, those enzymes work at a specific temperature range, and you know, low down here, below 50 degrees or so Fahrenheit, respiration is happening very slowly, and that means growth, right, is also going to be pretty slow, but relatively more sure that there's going to be enough glucose to allow it to continue to happen. Whereas on this side, the deficit might result in something much more damaging to the plant than just slow growth. And of course, again, you want to be in the zone here. You can see that photosynthesis. This one's showing something a little bit higher than the one on the left. The good zone is mid to upper 80s now, where most photosynthesis, photosynthesis is more than respiration, meaning growth potential is highest. Yeah, go ahead.
So you're saying that, like, unlike with transpiration where they have a mechanical way of slowing that, with respiration is kind of just a chemical reaction, runaway train. If the molecules are present, that reaction will take place and the plant can't stop.
Exactly right. Exactly right. At that point, temperature is determining how quickly those enzymes will function. So if the reactants are present, it's going to happen until they run out. Yep. So that's where you can get into the situation where you've eaten through all your stores and there's no energy left now. And then that starts to look like wilting. That starts to look like sacrificing outer leaves or getting those chlorotic spots on the tips and working their way in, you know, depending on the plant and the set of conditions. But that's a really good distinction to make, yes, that whereas the plant can shut stomata and try to reduce transpiration in the short term, in terms of respiration, it's just, there's no recourse besides what the conditions are. So if you can control the temperature, you know, somehow bring it down, you can help, but beyond that, it's going to respire as fast as that enzyme responds. And so one thing you can do there, sometimes, you know, is move air. That's always a good way to cool something down. But, excuse me, but otherwise, yeah, it's risky. And you know in the process, right, because, and here, releasing water too. So at these high temps, water needs high S as could be, because stomata are gonna need to open to get some CO2 in it, to keep living, right? To keep making some glucose, and this high respiration rate is gonna release a lot of water. At the same time, the media is probably drying up because temperature is high too. So this plant is under a lot of stress from water to get under high temperature. So, what's the best thing you can do for a plant on a really hot day? Water it. Shade would be great. Absolutely.
If you're planting on a hot day, I mean, I've heard it before, I don't know how true it is. Does it matter like what time you water your plant? Like if I decide to wake up before the sun comes out and soak my lawn, rather than waiting till noon when it's highest, does that mean that my soil is gonna absorb more water in the morning because the sun's not evaporating it? Or would the water absorb better with more heat?
Thoughts? Zach, until you nodding.
Probably cold, like in the morning you wanna water it, or at night, cause then the sun's gonna evaporate the water.
That's a major consideration there, right? Is as soon as that hot sun is in contact with the soil or with your media of any kind, it's going to start drying it out, which means that water then doesn't get to the plant. So, under lower temperature condition of the morning or the evening, right, you'll get less evaporation. But that's not the only consideration here either. Ideally, right, you'll have enough moisture throughout the day that the plant can keep taking it up the whole time. Just remember, right, it's going to be losing it through respiration. It's going to be needing it for plant processes, for cooling, for transpiration, and what else? And if there's not enough, and the xylem starts cavitating, starts getting air bubbles inside, now it's also not moving more water in those individual xylem tubes. So up front, important to have enough water at the beginning, because if you run out later and you start getting that air bubble, right, then you're not gonna, all of those that get blocked then aren't gonna move more water up after that fact. So general recommendation is water early on a hot day, and then how you water matters too. So you might start early with good soak, right? So it sinks in and the whole root zone is moist. And then later in the day, we do this frequently on the farm here when, you know, this summer we had, I don't know, a half a dozen days that were in the 90s. And so now, right, we're up here, right? We're hitting these thresholds where we might be getting no growth if we don't do something. And so then we use overhead sprinklers to just kind of mist, you know, every half an hour or so, just for a couple minutes. Just put some mist out on the leaves that will then evaporate, and in doing so, pull heat away and cool the leaves off, right, in the micro way that the leaf hairs might make it a little more wet there, right? Just in that immediate area around the surface of the leaf, pulling water away. Heat is in the water and it's removed, so it's slightly cooler now. So we use that sprinkling effect to reduce the temperature as well.
Is there also a possibility that when you do that in the middle of the day, that because there's water like on the leaf and the sun is reflecting down on it, that it can actually burn your leaves somewhat?
Yeah, good question. Has anyone seen that happen?
No.
Yes?
I saw it happen a little over.
I think so, it might be a bug, but I thought I saw like, bird marks.
Okay. Look out there.
No,
Others seen that? I mean, in theory, it's possible, right? That kind of magnifying glass effect. But I think in practice, I've been outside watering plants on very hot days a lot of times, and I've seen it very few times. I think that extreme, you know, the more temperature rises, the more it's a risk, right? If it's 120, which I haven't been in that, it's gonna be more risky. But if it's like 100 degrees, 105 degrees, I still think you're at a minimal risk for that. And the advantage, the upside of removing feed from the sprinkling is more worthwhile than not doing it.
The reward is way greater than the risk.
Yeah.
I had gone down that rabbit hole because of arguments on online gardening groups and,
Tell us,
the
yeah.
best, on the .edu stuff, the best I could come up with peer reviewed was that, water is not capable of magnifying sunlight to such a degree where it's actually going to like burn a leaf. I mean, and like you said, I think there's a lot of other factors at play when it's already that screwed up outside. The plant might look like crap. It's getting blamed on water on the leaves, but then like people make this thing where it's like, okay, well, I don't water because it's the middle of the day. Like the plant needs to have water if it's water stressed. So water and give it water so it can perform these functions you're talking about.
Yeah.
Don't just like, I can't water. Yeah, that's what people do. It's a real thing. And so like, give the plant water. It needs it.
Yeah, thank you.
Respiration.
Yeah, so, yeah, I've heard that question in this class and in the farm classes and stuff every year, and I think the fear about it's way overblown. And absolutely, water is better than no water, right? If for whatever reason things are dry and it's very hot, you should water, right? But still, to Andrew's earlier point, if you watered in the morning sufficiently and the soil is moist now, then you don't have to worry about that later. But if that didn't happen, or it's so hot that it's drying out, right? Sometimes it's hot and it's windy, and so things are really drying out fast now, right? Plants and soil. You may need to water more times, and, and I hope that I've made a point about how essential it is to not run out of water, right? For several reasons. Because then you not only get into the situation where you get that air bubble now where you can't even move the little bit of water that you have, right? But also you're just going to be losing more here, and you're not going to have, remember, from the roots in week 2, nutrients move into the soil in water. Right? So if you don't water because you're trying to avoid it or whatever, or you just are not irrigating enough, at some point, at these high temperatures where, for a while, right, we're doing a lot of growing there, a lot of photosynthesis, a lot of respiration, you need a lot of nutrients to power that. And so it has to come in water. So it's essential. Yes, go ahead.
You're saying that there's no potential gains for like holding off until the end of the day, like say after the sun goes down, there's no benefits to watering after?
Oh, I won't say no. I mean, there's still, right, so part of the calculus of watering early is to have sufficient water. Another part is to have the surface drier by the evening so that there's not this chance under cooler temperatures overnight for fungus or bacterial development to reduce disease, right? So that's a concern. But if your plant needs water and it's the middle of the day, you should water. There's no benefit in the however many hours between then and say sunset to wait to water stress that plant. Yeah, go ahead.
I use another aspect of that is regular watering as plants are developing roots where they can't move the nutrients and calcium in particular, and then people's tomatoes get blossom and rot, and they think that their soil is deficient, but it's just that the plant is not able to move the nutrient as it forms the root because it's water stress.
Absolutely, right? So under high temperature, then you're going to need, growth is faster, so you're going to need more calcium, right, to match the speed of the growth. And if that's going to come from the soil, it's going to come in water. So if you don't have enough water, then you're not going to get it in.
All the Thomas and crushed eggshells in the world is not going to fix your little problem.
That's right. It still has to already been getting at on my summary here on so what about all these things about respiration and photosynthesis. And the so what is that as people managing plants, you want to understand how these things affect it, because seeds need to be planted at a certain temperature in order to germinate. We talked about optimal germination temperature and the range of available germination temperatures. Plant growth stops at a certain temp. Right? We just showed it's too hot, it's not putting on more growth. Likewise, too cold, nothing is starting. And this might correspond with your maintenance schedules, whether that's like on a farm and how often you weed something, or in a greenhouse. If you set the temperatures to a known range, you're managing how quickly or how not quickly, how slowly something grows. So that's going to inform how often you need to manage for pests, how often you need to fertilize, right? How often you're moving air to cool things. So if you set it on the higher end of the range, you're going to need to do those things more regularly. And if you set it on the low range, the low end, you'll need to do them less. And you can, of course, one way to look at it is always maximize. Do the most, the fastest, right? And get the most things to sell in the least amount of time. Sometimes that's not all that matters, and you need to use the strategy of understanding to manage a situation for your particular needs. So I think our curriculum here is a good example, right? We're not for profit. There's all these built-in breaks coming up at the end of this term, those 3 weeks of no class, and so it doesn't benefit us to increase temperature in the greenhouse at that time, right? So we want to grow things more slowly then, so that we have to come in fewer times to fertilize or to supplementally water. And so we know by managing those conditions, right, setting the temperature to ventilate the greenhouse, say, at a lower temp, that will slow those things down, and likewise will reduce our disease potential by having more air move through, even if it's cold air. So plants can die if the balance is off, key reactants are missing, right, to that point about, not just die, but they can suffer in terms of less than maximum growth, right, poor fruit yield or output. Talked about the limiting factors, water, carbon dioxide, and oxygen, right, and of course light, in case of photosynthesis. If those things are not there, or not there in sufficient quantity, in some combination, that's going to change the result. And finally, lack of oxygen can create anaerobic conditions, and a great example is seeds or transplants growing in early spring outside in our climate, consistently wet, right? Very wet soil has low oxygen, and that means that anaerobic conditions are possible in the soil, meaning that less oxygen is getting into plant roots means that what?
Mold.
That what?
Mold.
Mold, rot, absolutely in the roots as it's sitting there. What about from these two processes?
That's respiration.
Akasha?
I was saying it has to generate more energy because it's anaerobic, so
It's gonna produce less.
more energy, that was going to.
Uh-huh.
You're breaking down, essentially for the fermentation process with the replacement of oxygen, you're needing to pull apart, is it that?
That's not.
Two things.
Yeah, well, you get a different result. Yeah, you get the ethanol, right, or the lactic acid, but what you don't get is as much energy,
Yeah.
right, without the oxygen. And so, what you need in the spring, right, is some energy for good growth. But if temperature is cold, right, that's going to slow down respiration. Very wet, that's going to slow down oxygen availability. Then it's hard to get things going. So, the point is, now you can use all these bits of knowledge, right, how plants are responding to the set of conditions in light of making food or getting energy from that food to decide how you're going to respond to get a specific result based on what you need. So now, it's time for this again, that it's also at the end of the photosynthesis presentation from last class. And just now that we've seen them both, I think it'll make a little bit more sense where they are, right? Chloroplasts, and then from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria, in the case of respiration. One, photosynthesis, of course, uses solar energy, the other produces chemical energy. Photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide, respiration uses glucose as carbohydrates. Photosynthesis builds up, and respiration breaks down into the energy that plants use. Photosynthesis uses water, and respiration releases water. Photosynthesis releases oxygen, and respiration uses oxygen. And you see how closely related these things are. Photosynthesis produces carbohydrates, sugar, glucose. Respiration produces carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis occurs in the presence of light, and at least we know the light reaction, the beginning step. And respiration, with or without light, and we can be taking glucose and making energy to our detriment. So respiration is always happening, so that means that always breaking down for basic life processes, base level metabolism, but not always making food, means you need to make enough food when it's possible to support all of that respiring at nighttime when it's not possible to make more glucose. But although remember, you can do the like independent reaction steps, of course, of actually putting the carbons together, depending on how much energy you absorb from the first step. Yeah.
Can the plant use CO2 produced during respiration for photosynthesis?
Yeah. Oftentimes that happens. If it's right nearby, right, much easier than to have to move it from somewhere else. Generally, it's not enough to meet the overall need. So it goes in and gets consumed, and still not a need to open to get more in. So this one too. Still comparing these, again, where it happens, what thing is involved. I said, don't worry about those names on those. They're both 3-carbon compounds. The Calvin cycle, the citric acid cycle, right? One builds up glucose and one breaks it down. What's doing the work, the name of those enzymes, the energy that goes in, and the formula, again, to just show you the relationship. All the same things, with the exception of sunlight, or supplemental light, as the energy source of photosynthesis, and ATP as the energy coming out of respiration. Here they are together, and kind of to John's question, you can use some of these things. CO2 is released, oftentimes it's proximal, and it ends up right here. Conveniently, in the balanced equation, but then when that's all used together, you want. So that homework assignment's due Monday. Short reading there. There's an activity on Monday comparing these two, doing some questions as smaller groups, try to make sense of it all, and leave your Monday having those two things clear, and then we'll, depending on the progress, probably quiz on those these two things together next Wednesday.
No, mine's on the back.
I mean, I saw the tasks that were on the list, hopefully, you know, we'll spread it.